All right, welcome viewers. Thank you so much for coming to our first virtual Women in Product discussion. We are so excited to have teamed up with Roadmunk to bring you a conversation between Priya Mathew Badger, the SVP of Product at Codeverse, and Maria Pereda, the Director of Product Design at Roadmunk, where they're going to discuss how to pivot based on new customer needs. Before we get started, just a little bit about Women in Product. We are an organization started several years ago out of the Bay Area devoted to increasing diversity and inclusion in product roles. The Chicago organization started over 2 years ago now, and we've been going strong ever since, thanks to our strong local community. We are always looking for ways to keep content and connections ongoing during these challenging times, and we really hope you enjoy the virtual conversation today. So I'm going to turn it over to Maria to tell you a little bit about Roadmunk before we get started.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm very excited to be here. So a little bit about Roadmunk before we get started. We're an end-to-end road mapping tool that allows teams to capture customer feedback, prioritize it, share it with their teams, and then prioritize what to build next and communicate with the entire organization via strategic roadmaps. You can find us at roadmunk.com. We have a wonderful free trial that you can sign up for. And if you need any help, any of our wonderful customer success people will help you. So let's get started. Priya, thanks for joining us today. I'm so excited that we're talking about your experience.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
Welcome. So you've been planning and building products at several places. You've been at Google working on their Gmail product, and more recently, you've gone to the ed tech industry. You worked at eSpark Learning at Codeverse. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into product?
Yeah, sure. So I started my career in economic consulting, so not in tech at all, but I was always super passionate about technology. I loved all of the Google products. I used to submit feature requests online to Gmail and Google Docs as a user. And then I was lucky enough to join the team, the Google Apps team in 2010 when the product was really taking off. And so it was an exciting time to be there as we were just starting to monetize and growing to millions of users. And I would say like one of the best things about that experience was just getting to see lots of different product teams because Google Apps is a suite. So, you know, seeing Google Docs, Gmail, Calendar, all those different teams and how they operate and how they did things, some things similar and some things different in terms of how they manage their products. After Google, I actually went back to business school at Northwestern, and I got a dual degree in the MBA program and the engineering design program there. And it was a really cool way to just build design thinking skills. And I started at eSpark in Chicago afterwards, and I love being here in Chicago and part of the community here, especially with the strong Women in Product network we have. And eSpark built a reading, math, and writing software that we sold to school districts. So you know, Gmail or Google Apps was a B2B product, but it was built on top of a consumer code base. eSpark sold to schools and nonprofits, and our end users were young kids in K through 8. So my first time designing products for kids as young as 4 and 5, which was a lot of fun, but also some new challenges. And then at Codeverse, we build a platform that teaches kids coding from 6 to 13, and we'll talk a lot about that. But Codeverse is a consumer company, so we're selling to parents who are signing up their kids. And so I'm still in that education space, but now working on the consumer side, which, you know, definitely has some different aspects to the product development than when you're working with organizations or businesses. So I have gotten to see some different experiences, be it big companies and smaller startups. And yeah, I'm excited to share some things that I've learned.
That's wonderful. You really have a diverse background of experiences. Gmail, which one could say everybody uses, and then little kids, which are their own breed, and now working with parents. Mm-hmm. So up until COVID hit, Codeverse was 100% based on in-person events and classes, right?
Yeah, so our business...
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. So our business model was we had physical retail, like brick and mortar studios that parents would sign their kids up for after school classes, camps, events, birthday parties. And at those, they would be using our online coding platform, and kids would be learning to code with our software. But we felt like, that was, sort of the consumer behavior at the time, is parents are used to signing their kids up for after school activities. And it was a good business model for us to get started with the company. And so 100% of our revenue was coming from that. Obviously with COVID, we ended up shutting down our studios during that time, and really had to rethink the entire business from the ground up in terms of what does the business model look like.
And that was such in such a short amount of time. Yeah. How did you handle that? How did the entire product process change? And how did you handle that pivot?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things that helped us was we have a very strong leadership team, and we're a small company. So we were able to kind of like all get in a room and we saw it coming, obviously, you see what's happening overseas. We had great board members who kind of gave us a heads up, like schools are going to close. You're probably going to need to close your studios. We talked about it even in our Q1 board meeting. And so we were thinking about it in advance. And luckily, we do have an online platform, and we knew that we had great assets in terms of like our instructors that teach at the studio. So a product we'd already considered was virtual tutoring one-on-one sessions, and we'd already sort of done a little bit of the groundwork, but this just super accelerated the timeline for that. And as a result, put everything else that wasn't that on the back burner. So I think a lot of, the changes came from just that, absolute focus on this is the product that makes sense for us during this time, and we all need to go all in on it. And in some ways, we kind of joke that like the studio's closing was the only way we could have made virtual tutoring successful as a product, just because it allowed the entire company and all of our resources to be focused on it.
That's fascinating. So before then, all your feedback collection and understanding insights was based on going in person and observing and interacting with both the parents and the students. How do you do your customer discovery now?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that attracted me to Codeverse and I loved about it, was it is really magical to be able to be sitting in a room with your users and just observing them as they're using it and come kind of in and out of the experience. But I will say that I actually think in some ways, the doing things virtually has made it easier, because we record every session that kids are doing in our online sessions. And so I can go back at any time and watch those recordings and rewind and watch them again, which is much harder to do in an in-person setting. And we also, started a parent survey where after every session we would survey parents about their experience and their kids' experience. And that just gave us like a really rich data set that we hadn't had before. And I think when parents are thinking about the product as an online experience, they're then more comfortable giving that feedback in an online way versus in the studio. A lot of the feedback came in more anecdotally through like conversations they'd have at the front desk or with our staff. The other thing that I've done that I think is a little bit new is like joining some Facebook groups, like moms groups, and doing like kind of social monitoring. There's just a lot of challenges facing parents right now, and everyone's talking about it. And so it's been interesting to see some like pretty direct questions in some of these moms groups about, the problem and opportunity that we're working on. So people literally asking like, I need an activity for my kids and I want them to do some kind of online coding. What should they do? And just seeing how they phrase it, seeing the responses to that, and some of the things that they bring up has been really insightful. And so I think that there's just more activity online with parents looking for resources and connecting with each other. And that has been really helpful to watch and observe as well.
That's fascinating. What do you do? So now you're getting tons of information, which compared to before is just, the volume sounds incredible. How do you handle that? How do you absorb that and turn it into something actionable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, even in the case that you have a lot of uncertainty, and you always need to have some kind of plan and some kind of focus. And so, for us, like we kind of came up with what are the objectives that we need to do. And part of it was just transitioning. So like, how do we get our current customer base to move over to this new platform. And that was our first focus. And then once we got a majority of those customers to move over, then the next focus was like, how do we attract new customers and how do we grow that customer base? And then how do we now we're really focused on retention, as well as obviously everything else continues to be important. But so I think when you have those focus areas, you're able to better like figure out like where's the feedback that you need to pay attention to. When we were focused on our existing customers, it was, you know, a lot of like looking at that parent survey, watching those initial videos and figuring out like what about this experience feels different than the studio in good ways and in bad ways. And now that we are online, how do we make sure that our experience still feels premium? And how do we make sure that it's still on brand for what we want, which is like the best educational experience for kids learning to code? So one example is like when we first launched virtual, we had small group classes because we do classes in the studio. We figured we'd do classes online. We made them pretty small. They were only like 3 or 4 kids, but we just saw that like that wasn't the premium experience when you were online because there were kids of multiple ability levels and ages. And in the studio, it works because the guide can kind of go along and work with each kid. But in the online setting, it was much more difficult to manage. And so at least in the beginning, we decided that even though it's more expensive for us to do it this way, we would do all of our, we would give every studio member a one-on-one session in exchange for every class they would have had at the studio, which is obviously much more costly operationally, but I think was worth it just from that goal of like really providing customers the value that we believed met our brand. Now later we ended up kind of launching a virtual camps product, which does have a group setting, but has different programming and different techniques that we added in order to manage that group setting. So, and then now we're kind of going through that same process of watching videos from camp and trying to figure out like where are the things that we need to troubleshoot and improve on.
So that's interesting. You're talking about this bet of this premium experience, which operationally is much more expensive. How do you bring along the rest of your company in a bet like this? How do you have the confidence that maybe this is the right move to make?
Yeah, I mean, like some of it is trial and error because we had a mix. Like we had one-on-one classes and we had group classes, and so we knew that the one-on-one sessions were getting amazing feedback and the group sessions were a little bit mixed. And so some of it was just like bringing that customer feedback, those recordings, those quotes from parent feedback to the light of the leadership team. And, you know, there are other people who are hearing that feedback, not necessarily from the product perspective, but from, you know, the people who are working customer service for parents or the sales team who might be following up and trying to convert that customer. So it was coming from multiple angles as well. But I think the real thing was just like being okay, making a big bet and like knowing that you don't know if you're right. So I think that was, you know, one of the things our CEO said was we're kind of being faced with a series of like somewhat impossible to make decisions. And at the end of the day, we just want to be able to look back and be proud about the decisions that we've made and feel like they reflected the values of our company. And so that was always like a guiding function for us. You know, one of the things we did was we closed a week or 2 before the stay-at-home order, which we could have made money off of the studios being in session, especially because parents were desperate when schools closed. So there was a gap between when schools closed and when organizations like us would have been required to close. But we felt like the right thing to do was to close and like protect our staff and protect the kids and just move faster to virtual. And that's what we did. And then the other decision we made was not to lay anyone off, which required like some really tough budget and financing questions around like, how do we make the space for this? And how do we find a business model that will work that can support keeping everyone on staff? So, so there were a lot of decisions that I would say we didn't know that they were going to work out, but they reflected like the values and the brand of the company, and they felt like the right thing to do. And I think they were also all things that you can reverse and change over time. And so you at some point just have to go with it.
So this is very interesting. You went from being 100% in person to virtual in a matter of 2 months.
Yep.
Along with that, you found a new customer base, because now you're not only virtual in Chicago, but you found pockets of customers all over the place. And what do you see is next for Codeverse based on these? You have a new audience. We don't know what's going to happen. The future is uncertain. I think we all can agree on that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing like how much virtual has grown and succeeded, and I think it exceeded like our wildest expectations. We pretty quickly hit our same revenue numbers as we were reaching in the studio, which we were amazed by. And then this month alone, we've added more members than one of our entire studios added in 2 years of growth. So
amazing.
So the growth online is amazing. I think, you know, a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that there's a massive national audience, that this is a special time when parents are looking for activities online. But, you know, I think one of the things that we consider is, you know, like with everything in COVID, there are companies that have, I was talking to a venture capital investor friend of mine who put it this way: there's companies that they think of as having headwinds in COVID, and then ones that have tailwinds. And we certainly are in the category of having some great tailwinds from the behavior changes that have happened from COVID, with more at-home learning and parents looking for activities for their kids. But the other question that people are asking is like, well, for some people's businesses, those behavior changes are going to be temporary. Like as soon as people go back into, you know, work or into offices, like those changes may not last. But I think and then other ones, they seem to be like permanent lasting changes to how people will behave. Telemedicine is like one of those where like people are very bullish that like more people will want to do telemedicine because it's more convenient. And I think, you know, virtual online activities is another thing that is likely here to stay. I think a lot of parents have kind of understood better what that could look like for their kids, and kids have experienced it and enjoy it. Now, I don't think that's going to be true for every online activity. Like I think the ones that are more physical, like ballet or karate or music lessons, are probably going to go very quickly back into being in-person experiences. But something like coding, which is very natural to do online, I think will be a really big growing market in the future now that parents have acclimated more to doing an after-school activity online, like a coding lesson. So we're very bullish on virtual and the growth there, and we're just continuing to invest a ton in it and scale and make really big bets.
What advice would you give to a company that wants to start getting customer feedback, but they don't know how to do it?
That's a good question. I mean, I think like not trying to over-engineer it and just try to get something quick and dirty out there. For example, like we just made a Google form and manually texted it to every parent after their session, and then like did an email blast, and it was great for getting awesome feedback. Now that we're trying to scale the program, we built in like a survey model into our database, and we're going to have nice pop-ups that come up after your session. But you know, to just start getting that feedback, you don't need a lot. You can just use the tools that exist for you. And then the other thing I would say is like most customers want to talk to you and give you feedback. Pretty much any parent I've ever reached out to, and when I was working in a school or business environment, any business or teacher, they are the ones using your product. They have a lot of ideas, they have a lot of feedback. And so I found it pretty easy to connect with current customers. The other thing I would say is like, you don't necessarily need to talk to people who are already using your product in order to get feedback. I've gotten really great feedback from people in women in product, for example, just asking like, hey, are there moms with kids in this age range that would be willing to talk to me about this? And sometimes talking to people who don't use your product yet, but are kind of in the market or in the persona is really helpful. And friends and family or professional networks can be really great grounds for that. So I think sometimes, you know, our company like doesn't have any formal process for doing discovery work. So I don't think you have to necessarily ask for permission or get a budget. I think it's all about just getting out there and figuring out where's a good place to start.
That's great advice. I think sometimes people are a little bit shy because they think it's going to be a big enterprise or it takes a lot of money or a lot of investment. So these are great practical tips.
And I will say that, like, if you do it the quick and dirty way, it can also build the business case for doing it in the more scalable, like, way that you want it. Like, when I was lobbying for us to, like, put this data model into the survey, I could point to, like, 10 different times I'd used the parent survey data that we'd collected through a Google form. So it was really easy to justify that and justify the questions that we wanted on there because we had already kind of prototyped it.
That's great. You brought up this data model. What would you say to companies that say we're data driven, we don't need to talk to people because we have all this data?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we look at the data all the time about, like, you know, what is the usage and the actual behaviors of kids and parents on the platform. And that's another benefit of having everything happening online, is that we can really, like, tie all the activities together. But I would say that the data, I always think about it as, like, the data tells you what happened, but talking to users tells you why it happened. And it can be really hard, you know, if I look at the data and I can see, like, oh, it looks like kids are engaging with this type of activity, but nobody's doing this other type of activity. I know that that happened, but I don't know why it happened. And so that's where I think, like, talking and observing, talking to users and observing them gives you more insight into that. And then I also think, like, sometimes things just don't always show up in the data, or they will show up, but they will show up, like, much later than when you want to know about it. So, and especially considering how quickly we want to be able to react to issues when we're building this totally new business from the ground up, and we have a lot of pressure for it to succeed because it's entirely replacing the revenue that we lost. So one example is, like, we had a lot of, we were using Zoom as our, like, we were kind of using, like, a compilation of tools to get these one-on-one sessions off the ground. So we used Zoom, we used Calendly, and then we had our own internal systems. And it did work at the beginning. So the data would, like, point you to the direction of, like, this is all fine. But if you looked at the customer feedback, there were just, like, these kind of hints and rumblings of, like, I wish this was integrated into the product, or, like, Zoom doesn't work for me, or I'm concerned about Zoom privacy, or, like, this, like, it was hard to get set up. And so even though customers often, like, rate us at, like, a 5 out of 5 on their experience, like, we could still see these comments coming up frequently. And then at the same time, it was also really costly for us on the operations side to just pull all these tools together and make them all work. So we ended up investing in virtual video integration. So now we have video integration right into our platform. When kids log into our coding platform, they see the video of the guide in the corner, and we don't have to use Calendly or Zoom anymore, which we just rolled out last week. But if we had only been looking at the data, we would have probably not seen that until, you know, customers were starting to cancel, or we were seeing it in retention. And then we'd have to dig in later. And so that's, you know, something that you can get early signals on what your users' needs are.
That makes, yeah, it seems like you can anticipate things rather than react to them a little later. I want to get back to prioritizing customer feedback. Do you use any frameworks specifically, or how do you manage to decide what moves the needle, what doesn't move the needle, what do we invest in, what do we not invest in?
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky, you know, one of the hardest things you have to do as a product leader is, you know, make those trade-offs. I always say, like, the best framework to me is, like, starting with really clear company goals and strategy. If you have that, then the product needs sort of uncover themselves, right? Like, because you've leaned into, like, what are the most important things for us to accomplish as a company? And then what's our strategy for how we get there? And then from that, you can derive like, okay, based on these goals, what does the product need to do, or how does it need to change to be able to meet those goals? And, you know, obviously, like as you're doing the discovery and the process of building, that solution changes over time, but you at least know what goals and what you're aiming for. And I find like that framework works really well because it just provides filter and focus. Because the challenge if you use, you know, another framework, like I know, you know, like in other like teams or companies, like there's like people will weigh like the impact versus the effort or something like that, and you have like some kind of like matrix for that. And I think it logically makes sense. The problem is like you could have an infinite amount of ideas and you're going through this like, you know, exercise that feels almost mathematical about like ranking all these different ideas. But at the end of the day, like you don't really know the effort until you know the solution, which you don't know until you start the discovery process and you actually start building it. And so, and there's just too many things to actually be able to like come up with a rank order for all of those. So you need to have the company goals and strategy side in order to filter down that list.
Yeah, there seems to be a new framework every couple of weeks that it's supposed to solve all your problems, and they all seem to carry some sort of crutch with them.
Yeah, for sure.
But I do
would say like sometimes you just don't like there's not I don't think there's a right answer, you know, like to that prioritization question. You just kind of have to get the best information you can and make decisions, and then, you know, be open to changing those decisions as information changes.
Yeah. This was very helpful, and I hope whoever is listening is finding this very informational. I'm going to ask you a few rapid fire questions.
Sure.
What's the one piece of advice you would give a product manager or leader who's trying to navigate how to adapt to this time?
I think it comes back to like bring yourself back to your brand and your values as you're making those decisions. And like I said, like I think it can be hard because you don't have a lot of information in this time about like what's going to happen next. And so just making sure like your brand and your values aren't going to change. And so trying to put things through that filter, I think, can be helpful. And then the other thing would be like, you know, imagine the different scenarios that could play out for your product or for your company, and try to see, are there things that you can prioritize that make sense no matter which way the scenarios play out. That's like another thing that I think was helpful for us. Like we picked certain things because we knew no matter what, like this is going to help improve the product experience.
That makes a lot of sense. Have a contingency plan.
Yeah.
If you could give Priya from February a piece of advice, what would that be?
That's a good question. I think I would say like don't be afraid to move faster and like bet big. There were probably some times when we stayed a little too long in the like half 1 foot in this old business, 1 foot in the new business, you know, out of like habit of this is what we had done before, so we're not quite ready to totally cut it off. I would say, I mean, we actually ended up moving very quickly, but we could have moved even faster, I think, at certain times. The integrated video chat is a good example of like just ripping off the Band-Aid and doing it, even though it is a lot of work, just made a much better experience. Closing the studios. Also, we had a lot of physical materials, like printed content that kids used in the studio, and we ended up transitioning it all digitally after we just saw how much of a pain it was going to be to like mail everybody these materials. So all those things like we eventually did, but I think there was a little bit of hesitation at times to cut over. You know, like, is that the right decision to totally leave behind what we had before? Like another example is like we entirely overhauled our website to be all about virtual, but it took us a couple weeks to decide to do that because that wasn't our product, you know? So like to completely change your homepage is a big, almost like emotional decision, I think, for the team. So, so yeah, I think my advice to my February self would be just don't be afraid and move fast. And I think the more you hang on to the past, the harder it is to move on to the future. And not being afraid to even let go of some customers. You know, I think we really love every single customer and kid that was using the product in the studios, but the reality was the new product wasn't a fit for every single one of them. And even though we had really good retention of that customer base, it wasn't 100%. But the opportunity for the new customer base that we were able to acquire was huge. And so being willing to let go of some of that enabled us to grow a lot faster.
Yeah, I see that one as a common fear of many products that are evolving, that they're like, but what do we do with these customers? And sometimes it's like you have to rip the Band-Aid off and be like, you just have to leave them behind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's hard. I understand.
Yeah.
Well, and one last thing, if you had to recommend a book to anyone, it can be a product management book, it can be a design thinking book, what would it be?
I really love the book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. It's kind of like a business strategy book. I think it's great for product. You know, as PMs, often like we know everything inside out about product management. We've read it, we've studied it, we're thinking about discovery, but strategy is so important, as I said, to provide that layer before you get into planning, to really make sure that you have goals and a strategic plan in place before you then are picking prioritization. So I think that book is great. It has a lot of great frameworks and examples for how you can come up with strategy, both as a company and I think also for your product.
Thank you. I'm writing it down and that will be my next read.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This concludes our discussion, and Lauren, welcome back. You're on mute.
Yep. That's the problems of today's world, right? You forget when you're on mute.
Problem.
Thanks, guys. That was an awesome conversation. I like particularly love hearing about new user bases and honestly how similar they can be to all the other user bases that we have, because our tactics are often so similar. And I loved hearing about how relevant that qualitative feedback and like adaptability is, particularly during these times. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective, and Maria for helping us hear a little bit more about Priya's.
My pleasure. I learned so much.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's great chatting with you, Maria.
Likewise.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you all for watching. Women in Product would love to hear from you. We're always looking for ways to help our community continue to feel connected, and we're always looking for speakers and new event ideas. So please come find us on womenpm.org. You can click on the Chicago community and sign up for our weekly newsletter, or you can, of course, email us at chicagowip@gmail.com for more info as well. Thanks a lot for tuning in and watching, and we'll see you at our next event.